The courtroom was supposed to be routine that morning. Papers shuffled, lawyers whispered, the usual hum of order lingered in the air. But then, with one sharp glance and a smirk curling at the edges of her lips, Judge Edith Jones cut through the silence. Leaning forward, her voice carried a mocking edge that was impossible to ignore. "Well, Congresswoman Crockett," she said, her tone laced with condescension. "Perhaps if you adjusted that attitude of yours, the law might start listening." The words dropped heavy, landing like stones in water. A ripple moved through the room. Gasps, raised eyebrows, whispers, buzzing. In a chamber where dignity was supposed to prevail, here was one of the most powerful judges in the country mocking an elected representative, dismissing her as if she were nothing more than a child misbehaving in class. All eyes turned to Jasmine Crockett. For a moment, the cameras caught the faintest flicker in her expression. Surprise, maybe even a flash of anger. But then something else emerged, a calm, unflinching resolve. The kind of resolve that only comes from years of being underestimated, dismissed, and told to know your place. The air seemed to tighten. The room waited. Would she let the insult pass? Would she absorb the humiliation, as so many had been forced to do before her? Or would she risk everything, your reputation, standing, even the wrath of the bench, to answer back? Judge Jones leaned back slightly, still smirking, convinced the young Congresswoman would falter under the weight of that courtroom glare. But what she didn't realize was that Jasmine Crockett had walked into that chamber carrying more than her own name. She carried the voices of those who had been silenced, the strength of those who had been overlooked, and the fire of those who had been mocked for daring to speak truth to power. And in just a few seconds, her response would leave not only the judge reeling, but an entire nation talking, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to bow her head. She was about to lift the room to its feet. To understand why this single moment carried so much weight, you have to understand who Judge Edith Jones is, and why her mocking tone struck a nerve far deeper than the walls of that courtroom. Judge Jones isn't just another jurist. She's a towering figure in conservative judicial circles, having sat on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals for decades. Known for her sharp tongue and scathing dissents, she built her reputation as a no-nonsense, iron-fisted enforcer of traditional order. To her admirers, she's a model of discipline. But to her critics, she's the very face of judicial arrogance, wielding power not as a shield of justice, but as a weapon to remind others of their place. And on that day, Jasmine Crockett became her target. The insult about Crockett's attitude wasn't just an offhand remark. It was layered with history, coded in the language of dismissal that countless women, particularly women of color, have faced in boardrooms, classrooms, and courtrooms for generations. It was a signal meant to belittle, to shrink her down, to remind her that she wasn't supposed to stand eye to eye with authority. But Crockett was not just any opponent. She was a congresswoman with a background in law, a woman who had spent her life fighting for the voiceless, and someone who had built her career refusing to be boxed in by stereotypes. And that's what made the stakes so high. This wasn't merely about a courtroom disagreement. It was about whether someone like Jasmine Crockett could claim space and command respect in one of the most elite, tradition-bound environments in America. Viewers watching later would say they felt the weight instantly. It wasn't just Jones versus Crockett, one commentator tweeted. It was old power versus new courage. And the tension didn't stop there. Because the cameras were rolling, the exchange was destined for public consumption. Every word, every gesture, every smirk and clapback would be dissected by millions. Judge Jones may have thought she was speaking in the insulated world of judicial authority, but in reality, she was speaking to an audience far larger. An America that has grown weary of arrogance in high places and hungry for authenticity in leadership. That's why the moment mattered. Because if Crockett faltered, if she shrank back under the weight of Jones's authority, the insult would stand as another chapter in a long history of dismissal. But if she answered, and answered with strength, it wouldn't just be about one courtroom exchange. It would be about rewriting the rules of engagement. The stakes were high, not only for Crockett, but for everyone who has ever been told to soften their voice, to hide their fire, to be respectable enough to fit in. The courtroom had become a stage for something much bigger than legal arguments. It had become a stage for a cultural clash between two Americas, one clinging to hierarchy and one demanding dignity. And Judge Edith Jones, with her mocking smirk, thought she was delivering the final word. But she hadn't yet reckoned with the fire burning inside Jasmine Crockett, because Crockett knew this was her chance. Not just to defend herself, but to show the world that arrogance could be humbled, and truth could still ring louder than condescension. And what came next would prove that she was more than ready for the fight. To fully grasp the weight of that smirk and those mocking words, you have to know who Judge Edith Jones is. Her presence on the bench was not accidental, nor was her reputation for sharp, withering remarks. Jones had spent decades climbing the ranks of America's judicial system, and with every step, she left behind a trail of decisions that painted her as uncompromising, unyielding, and, at times, unapologetically dismissive of those who dared to challenge her worldview. Appointed by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, Edith Jones became one of the most influential conservative judges on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Her tenure cemented her reputation as a defender of traditional order, often aligning herself with rulings that reinforced authority rather than questioned it. To her admirers, she was a steel spine in an era of shifting values. To her detractors, she was a symbol of judicial elitism, someone more interested in preserving hierarchy than ensuring justice. Over the years, her sharp tongue became almost as famous as her rulings. Lawyers whispered about her cutting comments during oral arguments, her impatience with those she considered unprepared, and her tendency to belittle advocates who didn't meet her exacting standards. Some called her brilliance uncompromising. Others simply called her arrogant. Her critics often noted something else: her tone. They claimed it wasn't just firm, it was dismissive, dripping with superiority, as if she saw the courtroom not as a place of balanced exchange, but as a stage where she alone dictated the rules of respect. For years, her demeanor went largely unchecked. After all, who would dare call out a senior federal judge? But beneath that veneer of authority lay a pattern. Time and again, Jones seemed to underestimate those who didn't look or sound like her ideal image of professionalism. Younger lawyers, women, advocates of color. Too often, her comments carried that subtle sting, not overtly stated in transcripts, but remembered by those who felt the brunt of her disapproval. And that's what made her mockery of Jasmine Crockett so familiar, so recognizable to anyone who had ever been told they were too much, too loud, too passionate, too fiery. Attitude, after all, is one of those words. A word used to control, to shrink, to box in someone who refuses to conform. It was the perfect encapsulation of Jones's style. Quick, sharp, dismissive. She thought she had pinned Crockett to the wall with one remark, stripping her of credibility before she could even mount a defense. But what Jones didn't realize was that she was walking into a different kind of fight. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another advocate standing nervously before the bench. She was a congresswoman, a lawyer in her own right, and a woman who had built her career on refusing to be silenced. And when Jones chose to mock her attitude, she wasn't just taking aim at Crockett's tone. She was dismissing her entire identity, her years of work, and the countless voices Crockett carried into that room. In a way, Edith Jones represented the old guard of American authority, a figure steeped in tradition, relying on hierarchy, convinced that her position alone commanded obedience. She was used to being feared, or at the very least, obeyed. She believed her smirk was enough to end the exchange before it even began, but arrogance has a way of blinding even the sharpest minds. And in that blindness, Judge Edith Jones made her critical mistake. By mocking Jasmine Crockett's attitude, she underestimated her. And worse, she underestimated the hunger of an audience watching for someone, anyone, to stand up and speak back to power. Because while Jones had decades of rulings behind her, Crockett had something far more dangerous in that moment: authenticity. And authenticity, once unleashed, has the power to pierce even the thickest armor of authority. So, when Judge Jones delivered her barb, she thought she was closing the door on debate. She thought the courtroom would laugh with her, or at least sit silently in agreement. Instead, she had just opened the door to a moment she would never be able to control, and the woman walking through that door was more than ready to shock the courtroom. Understand why Jasmine Crockett's reaction in that courtroom was so electrifying. You need to know where she came from, because nothing about her rise was accidental. Every step of her journey was shaped by resistance, resilience, and a refusal to be boxed in by the labels others tried to stick on her. Born and raised in St. Louis, Crockett grew up surrounded by the realities of working-class life. She wasn't born into privilege. She wasn't handed opportunities on a silver platter. She carved her path through grit, determination, and an unwavering belief that justice wasn't just a word for textbooks. It was a fight for real people. From a young age, she had fire in her voice. Teachers noted it. Peers admired it. Critics called it attitude. That word, the very one Judge Edith Jones would later spit out with disdain, was one Crockett had heard all her life. Too loud, too sharp, too direct. But Crockett learned early that what others dismissed as attitude was actually her greatest weapon, the ability to cut through pretense and speak hard truths. Her path to the courtroom wasn't straight or easy. After earning her law degree, she could have taken a comfortable route, joining a high-paying corporate firm. But that wasn't her. Crockett chose the grind of criminal defense and civil rights cases. She spent nights poring over files for clients who couldn't afford anyone else. She stood in courtrooms where every eye assumed she would lose, and time and again she proved them wrong. Her clients weren't the wealthy or the powerful. They were the marginalized, the overlooked, the voiceless. And every time she stood up in court, she carried their stories with her. Each victory was more than a win on paper. It was a strike against a system that too often tilted against the vulnerable. But Crockett didn't just stay in the courtroom. She brought her fight to the political arena, winning a seat in Congress. There, her style didn't soften. She wasn't interested in playing the game of politeness while her community suffered. She went toe-to-toe with Republicans who tried to steamroll hearings. She called out hypocrisy when others whispered. And yes, she did it with that same unapologetic energy that had defined her since her youth. To her supporters, she was a breath of fresh air, a leader who didn't just wear the title of representative, but embodied it. To her detractors, she was too much, too loud, too brash, too willing to challenge authority. Sound familiar? That's why her clash with Judge Edith Jones wasn't just about a single remark in a courtroom. It was the collision of two worlds, the old guard, clinging to outdated notions of authority, and the new guard, rising with authenticity, identity, and a refusal to bow. Crockett had faced dismissal before. She had heard the smirks, the whispers, the condescension, but every time someone tried to shrink her, she grew louder. Every time someone tried to corner her, she broke free. And in that moment before Judge Jones, all of that history, all of that training, all of those battles prepared her for what was about to come. Because Crockett wasn't just reacting to an insult. She was channeling the voices of every young Black woman who had ever been told to watch her attitude. She was speaking for every lawyer who had ever been underestimated, every activist who had ever been mocked, every truth-teller who had been silenced. That's the thing about Jasmine Crockett. She doesn't just walk into a room alone. She walks in carrying a community, a movement, and a fire that authority figures like Judge Jones can't quite put out. So when Edith Jones thought she was cutting Crockett down with that smirk, what she really did was ignite a spark that was about to blaze across the courtroom. Because unlike so many who had stood before Jones and wilted under her condescension, Crockett had been training for this moment her entire life. And in the seconds that followed, she would prove that attitude wasn't a weakness at all. It was power, and it was about to shock everyone who thought they had her figured out. The courtroom was charged with tension, every eye fixed on Jasmine Crockett as she stood to make her case. Across from her sat Judge Edith Jones, a figure known for her sharp tongue and colder stare. For decades, Jones had cut down attorneys with a single remark, and many had withered under her authority. When Crockett delivered a pointed line that exposed the weakness in the opposing counsel's arguments, the judge leaned forward. Her lips curled into a smirk. And with a slow, deliberate tone, she fired her shot. "Ms. Crockett," Jones drawled, "perhaps you'd do better if you could keep your attitude in check." The word hung in the air like a slap. Reporters froze mid-sentence. The audience murmured. Everyone knew what that remark carried. Not just a critique of courtroom decorum, but a coded dismissal, a condescending jab meant to shrink Crockett back into silence. Jones leaned back, clearly satisfied. She had used this tactic before, and it worked more often than not. But this time, she had chosen the wrong target. Crockett didn't flinch. For a moment, she simply let the silence settle, letting the insult sting the air long enough for everyone to feel its weight. Then she leaned forward, her voice calm but resonant. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "if by attitude you mean the refusal to sit quietly while injustice parades through this courtroom, then yes, I'll own that, proudly." The words sliced through the chamber. A ripple of reaction spread. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even some court staff exchanged glances. Crockett continued, her tone deliberate but unyielding. "The law is not meant to comfort the comfortable. It is meant to protect the vulnerable. And if conviction offends you more than corruption, then perhaps what this courtroom needs isn't less attitude, but more courage. The gasp from the gallery was audible. The smirk on Judge Jones's face wavered, just slightly, but enough for all to see. Crockett hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't lost her composure. Instead, she had turned the judge's weapon against her, transforming a moment meant to humiliate into a rallying cry for justice itself. The balance of power shifted in that instant. No longer was Crockett the young attorney being cut down by a senior judge. She stood tall as the voice of every lawyer, activist, and citizen who had been told to temper their passion, to hide their truth, to soften their fire. And as the courtroom leaned forward, breathless, one thing became undeniable. Edith Jones had underestimated Jasmine Crockett. The real clash was only just beginning. The chamber was still buzzing from Jasmine Crockett's sharp rebuke. But what came next turned the entire proceeding into a moment no one could forget. Judge Edith Jones adjusted her glasses, clearly rattled, though trying to mask it. She glanced at her notes, her lips tightening into a thin line. She had expected Crockett to shrink, to temper her words. Instead, Crockett had doubled down, and the atmosphere had shifted against the very authority the judge believed was ironclad. But Crockett wasn't done. She took a single step forward, grounding herself, her voice firm but steady. "Your Honor," she continued, "when you call conviction attitude, you attempt to frame passion for justice as a flaw. But history reminds us, every major change in this nation, civil rights, women's rights, workers' rights, began as attitude in the eyes of those who feared it." The audience stirred. The reporters leaned in, catching every word. Crockett pressed on, her delivery like a rising crescendo. "If this court cannot tolerate my insistence on truth, then perhaps the issue is not my tone, but the discomfort it creates for those who would prefer silence. I will not apologize for demanding fairness. I will not apologize for carrying the weight of people who cannot stand here themselves. That is not attitude. That is duty." Her words landed like strikes of a gavel. The opposing counsel shifted uneasily, their advantage evaporating with every sentence Crockett spoke. They had counted on Judge Jones to undercut her, but now it was the judge herself who looked on the defensive. Jones tried to interject, but Crockett's timing was flawless. She paused just long enough to command the silence, then delivered the line that silenced the room. "And with all respect, Your Honor, if defending my clients with clarity and courage makes me guilty of too much attitude, then I'll take that verdict." Every single day, the courtroom erupted in an audible gasp. Some in the gallery even clapped before quickly silencing themselves under the glare of court officers. Crockett, however, didn't bask in the moment. She simply stood tall, her expression calm, as if to say, "I've said what needed to be said." Judge Jones sat back, visibly unsettled. For the first time in years, her smirk was gone. She adjusted her robe, avoided eye contact, and gave a curt nod for the proceedings to continue. But the shift was undeniable. The room knew what had just happened. A young congresswoman and attorney had stared down one of the most notorious conservative judges in the country, and won. It wasn't just a clapback. It was a mic drop, a turning point. A reminder that authority, no matter how entrenched, could still be shaken when confronted with courage and clarity. And as Crockett returned to her seat, the energy in the chamber was unmistakable. She had done more than silence Edith Jones. She had redefined the moment. But what came after the hearing? The fallout. The reactions, the shockwaves across media and politics, would prove just how seismic this clash really was. The gavel came down, but no one was thinking about the case anymore. They were thinking about what they had just witnessed. Jasmine Crockett standing toe-to-toe with Judge Edith Jones and flipping the courtroom dynamic in real time. It was one of those moments you could feel in the air. The sense that something bigger than a single exchange had just happened. The first ripples began the second the hearing adjourned. Reporters bolted for the exits, phones pressed to their ears, already dictating headlines. Cameramen replayed their footage, shaking their heads in disbelief at how seamlessly Crockett had transformed a dismissal into a defining statement. By the time she left the courthouse, the clip had already begun making its way across Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube. The hashtag #OrangeAttitudeOfJustice was born within an hour. Supporters flooded social media, celebrating the way Crockett had reframed the insult. Memes exploded. Side-by-side screenshots of Judge Jones's smirk melting into unease, overlaid with Crockett's line, "Maybe this courtroom doesn't need less attitude, but more courage." Commentators picked it up instantly. progressive voices praised Crockett for calling out the coded language so often used against women, especially women of color, in professional spaces. What Judge Jones called attitude, one columnist wrote, was simply conviction with a backbone. And Crockett reminded the world that courage is contagious. Even celebrities joined in. A-list actors reposted the clip on Instagram, applauding her fire. Musicians quoted her line in lyrics on Twitter. And activists around the country echoed her words in rallies and speeches, treating it as a new mantra for resistance. But it wasn't just the left celebrating. Moderates who rarely spoke out were struck by the poise and precision of Crockett's clapback. Editorial boards wrote cautiously admiring pieces, noting that while courtroom decorum is important, Jones's remark had crossed a line. For once, the establishment didn't quite know how to defend one of its own. Meanwhile, conservatives scrambled to contain the fallout. Right-wing pundits attempted to frame Crockett's response as grandstanding, but their arguments rang hollow. The clip itself was too powerful, too undeniable. Every replay only reinforced how one-sided the exchange had been. Instead of weakening Crockett, the attacks only amplified her visibility. Inside political circles, whispers began circulating. Some speculated that this moment had vaulted Crockett onto a new stage. She wasn't just a sharp attorney and congresswoman anymore. She had become a symbol of defiance against condescension and systemic arrogance. Back in her district, the impact was even more profound. Constituents packed town halls to thank her. Young law students spoke about how inspired they felt watching her dismantle a federal judge's attempt to belittle her. Teachers showed the clip in classrooms, using it as an example of resilience under pressure. And the judge herself? Edith Jones remained silent. No public statements. No interviews. But those who followed her career knew. Silence, in this case, was telling. For once, she wasn't the one who had the last word. The shockwaves of that moment stretched far beyond the courthouse. It became not just a headline but a cultural flashpoint, sparking conversations about authority, bias, and the courage it takes to speak truth to power in the most intimidating of spaces. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just shut down a judge. She had given voice to a generation tired of being told to sit quietly. And yet, even as the celebrations rolled in and the memes multiplied, one question loomed large. What would this moment mean for her future? Because Crockett had just proven she could silence a federal judge with a single line? But the battles ahead, in politics, in the courts, in the public arena, would demand even more. The country was watching. And waiting. In the days after the clash, as the clip of Jasmine Crockett's response circled the globe, a deeper conversation emerged. It wasn't just about one congresswoman standing up to a federal judge. It was about what her stand represented. A broader struggle over who gets to speak with authority, who gets dismissed, and who gets to define the terms of respect. For generations, figures like Judge Edith Jones had embodied the weight of the establishment. Authority was measured in age, in tenure, in pedigree. Deference was expected, especially from those who didn't fit the mold of power. When Jones smirked and threw out the word attitude, it wasn't just a critique of tone, it was the echo of centuries of coded dismissal. Women told to smile more. Black professionals told to soften their voices. Activists told to wait their turn. Crockett's answer flipped that script. She didn't deny it. She didn't retreat. She embraced it and redefined it, turning attitude into something righteous, something necessary, something courageous. In that moment, she reclaimed a word designed to diminish and transformed it into a banner under which others could rally. And that's why the moment resonated so far beyond the courtroom. It wasn't just lawyers who saw themselves in her defiance. It was young professionals walking into boardrooms where they weren't expected to belong. It was activists facing sneers from politicians. It was students being told to quiet down when they spoke their truth. Crockett became a mirror, reflecting back their struggles, and at the same time, a beacon, showing them a way forward. Her message was simple but profound. Dignity is not passive. It is active. It demands the courage to speak even when silence would be safer. It requires standing tall even when authority tries to push you down. That's the moral thread tying her story together. Crockett showed that true respect isn't given by authority figures. It's claimed by those who refuse to be silenced. Her reaction to Jones's mockery wasn't just a clever clapback. It was an act of reclaiming space in a system designed to edge her out, but the power of her words also carried a warning, a challenge to all who witnessed it. Because if courage is contagious, then so is complacency. Crockett's stand reminded people that it isn't enough to admire defiance from afar. The real test is whether each person who cheered her on will bring that same conviction into their own lives, their own workplaces, their own communities. That's why her line, "Maybe this courtroom doesn't need less attitude, but more courage," struck so deeply. It wasn't just about her, it was about all of us. About whether we will continue to bow to outdated norms or rise with authenticity and strength. Even political analysts, usually allergic to lofty ideals, acknowledge the moment's significance. This was more than a courtroom exchange. One commentator wrote, "It was a cultural reset. It showed that truth-telling with conviction can cut through even the most intimidating walls of authority. And it wasn't lost on anyone that Crockett delivered her words without rage, without losing composure. She modeled a balance that is rare but powerful, fierce yet composed, passionate yet principled. She didn't abandon professionalism, she redefined it." In the weeks that followed, young women across the country began sharing their own stories under the hashtag #MockMoreCourage. Stories of pushing back in meetings, stories of refusing to let themselves be silenced in classrooms, stories of standing tall in the face of dismissal. Crockett's courtroom moment had planted a seed, and it was already sprouting in countless lives. Her critics tried to spin it, of course. They argued she had disrespected the bench. They claimed her attitude was unbecoming. But each critique only underscored the very point she had made, that courage unsettles those who rely on silence to maintain their dominance. The lesson, ultimately, is bigger than one courtroom, bigger than one judge, bigger even than one congresswoman. It is this. When faced with condescension, when someone tries to shrink your voice, the most radical act is to answer with clarity, conviction, and dignity. Jasmine Crockett showed that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to speak anyway. And in doing so, she reminded America that justice is not served by the meek, but by the bold. That is why her response will live on far longer than the smirk that provoked it, because moments of arrogance fade. But moments of truth endure, and Crockett's truth, that dignity requires courage, and courage requires voice, is now etched into the story of a nation still learning how to listen. So, what do we take away from this explosive exchange between Judge Edith Jones and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett? It wasn't just another courtroom clash. It was a cultural flashpoint. A moment that peeled back the layers of power dynamics, exposed the old guard's tactics of dismissal, and revealed what it truly means to stand firm in the face of authority. Judge Jones thought she could reduce Crockett with a single word, attitude. But Crockett turned that word into her weapon. Her clapback wasn't just clever, it was commanding. It showed the courtroom and the country that confidence rooted in truth is stronger than any smirk or mockery. This is why her response matters. Because we live in a time when voices of dissent are too often minimized, when standing up for justice is dismissed as being difficult, and when power tries to shame passion into silence. Crockett reminded us that passion and principle, when fused together, are unstoppable. And here's the challenge for you, the viewer. The next time someone tries to downplay your conviction, the next time you're told your voice is too much, remember Crockett's words. Remember that courage isn't about softening who you are to fit into the room. Courage is about standing tall and making the room adjust to you, because in the end, it's not the smirks or the insults that history remembers. It's the moments when someone refuses to back down. Jasmine Crockett did that. And now, it's our turn. If you believe voices like hers deserve to be amplified, don't just watch. Share this. Subscribe, comment, and keep this conversation alive. Because the fight for dignity, courage, and truth isn't over. It's only just beginning.